What if I were to tell you that no matter what, the United States will not be defaulting on its debt come June 1st? What if I were to tell you that this meant Janet Yellen has been lying about Congress needing to raise the debt ceiling or else we would default? What if I were to tell you that no matter what, the United States will continue making payments on its debt regardless of whether the debt ceiling is raised or not? And most importantly, what if, most importantly, this outcome, not raising the debt ceiling and continuing to make the debt payments, is actually the best possible outcome for our nation? Well, considering all the news recently has been about America defaulting on its debt and how everybody's focusing on the talks about raising the debt ceiling, you may be surprised to hear that none of that is actually true. It is all just smoke and mirrors. And I'm going to show you why. Real quick, a word from today's sponsor, OneGold. Considering all the reckless spending going on by the government these days, the out of control inflation, and the bank failures, many people are looking to preserve their purchasing power with precious metals like gold, silver, and platinum. The problem is, most people have most of their wealth inside their retirement accounts, like their 401k. This is an issue because almost every 401k plan out there does not allow you to make any allocation to precious metals. This is where OneGold comes in with a precious metals IRA. Just because the average 401k does not allow precious metals doesn't mean that you as an individual are not allowed to hold precious metals inside of your retirement account. You simply need to set up something called a self-directed IRA. A self-directed IRA allows you to make the decisions on how to invest your money instead of your employer. And a self-directed precious metals IRA with OneGold allows you to invest that money in gold and silver. OneGold offers one of the lowest cost IRA solutions there is. Premiums are much lower on vaulted metals versus physical metals, which means you get to end up with more ounces for the same dollars. And unlike with most traditional precious metals IRAs, OneGold acts as both the precious metals dealer and the depository. This means you can place transactions 24/7 without actually having to contact a dealer. And obviously, since this is within an IRA, just like any other IRA, you have those tax benefits, either the tax deferral of a traditional IRA or the tax-free growth of the Roth IRA. It's extremely easy to get started by either making new contributions to a new account, or you can even roll over funds from a previous retirement account. To get started, visit the link in the description below. So here's the standard story that the media is selling to everybody right now. Either Congress raises the debt ceiling, or we plunge into a global economic catastrophe because the federal government can no longer make payments on its debt. In reality, this is not true. It is utterly false and cannot happen. First, let's take a look at the actual financial situation the federal government is in right now. During the year 2022, the federal government brought in just under $4.9 trillion in revenue. Unlike business revenue, government revenue means they took that money through taxes. So the government takes $4.9 trillion out of the economy. So that's how much they took. How much did they spend? They spent just about $6.3 trillion. So they take $4.9 trillion, but they spend $6.3 trillion. So how do they make up that difference? Well, they do this by borrowing. And the amount that they have to borrow to make up the difference between what they take and what they spend is called the deficit. Every year that they have a deficit, that adds to the total national debt. Households work the exact same way. Imagine you make 100 grand in a year, and instead of spending 100 grand, you decide to spend 120 grand. That year you had a 20 grand deficit because that's how much you spent on top of what you made. And so that would only be able to come from debt. So your total household debt would increase from $0 to $20,000. And every year you repeated that, your total debt would grow. Every year you had a deficit. The federal government in the current situation has reached a debt ceiling though. So this is like if you or I had maxed out our credit card. If we had a $50,000 line of credit on our credit card and we spent it all, well, it wouldn't allow us to accumulate more debt on that credit card. We'd go to swipe it and the transaction wouldn't go through. We're already maxed out. If we want to be able to use our credit card again, we have to pay down some of that debt, and then we can go back up to that limit. It's the same thing with the federal government. They're at the debt ceiling right now, so if they want to be able to borrow more, they can only borrow more if they're at the same time paying off the same amount of debt. Now, if you start to put these pieces together, you see where I'm going with this. The debt ceiling doesn't actually mean that the federal government can no longer borrow any more money. It just means that they can't on net continue to increase the amount of total debt that they have. So let's go back to the drawing board here and start doing some math so we can see how this would play out if the debt ceiling does not get raised. In 2022, the federal government received $4.9 trillion in taxes. The estimate for 2023 is $4.6 trillion. So it is a little bit less than 2022, but not substantially less. The amount that the federal government spent in 2022 was $6.3 trillion. So they borrowed an additional $1.3 trillion to make up the difference. If the debt ceiling is not raised, that means they will no longer be able to continue to pile on new debt. If they do take out new debt, it can only be to pay off that old debt so that the total debt they have stays the same. But wait, there's a problem with that. What's the problem? Interest rates. Borrowing costs have continued to increase for the federal government over the last couple of years. This means every time they take out new debt in order to pay off some of that old debt that is maturing, they owe the principal back. They're paying off debt that's maybe 1%, but they're getting new debt that's maybe 4 or 5% in order to pay off that old debt. So the expenses on their interest are growing even if their total debt pile is not growing at all. Over the next decade, the projected cost of just paying interest on the debt is expected to go from where it's at right now, under $700 billion, all the way up to $1.5 trillion. The CBO projects that during 2023, it'll owe about $663 billion in interest. And next year in 2024, it'll be about $745 billion. Let's go back to the drawing board and do some math on their financial situation. Last year, their income was about $4.9 trillion. This year, it's gonna be a little bit less at about $4.6 trillion. They're gonna owe about $663 billion total in interest. Remember, they can take out new debt in order to pay off old debt, so long as they are not taking out more new debt. The only cost they incur from that is the additional interest cost from the new debt being a higher interest rate debt. So it is not that they are not allowed to borrow, it's just that they can't borrow more than they're paying off. This means that the total cost of maintaining the debt for 2023 is about $660 billion. But how much are they going to bring in from taxes in 2023? About $4.6 trillion. Some quick head math shows that 4.6 trillion minus 600 billion leaves about $4 trillion left over to spend. It is true that in 2022, they spent 6.3 trillion. Going from spending 6.3 trillion down to 4 trillion is a big drop, but it's a big drop from a massive high. This is not the norm. Remember all those spending packages that they passed in 2020 and 2021 and all of the spending that they're continually trying to do? Build Back Better, the American Rescue Plan, the CARES Act, all this extra spending is abnormal, not normal, which means that without being able to borrow extra, you can only borrow new to pay off old. You have the extra interest expenses, you've got $4 trillion left over to spend. That means all the federal government has to do is go back to 2017 spending levels. This is the chart of how much the federal government spends every year in total. So all we have to do is return to normal. This isn't a massive detrimental cut. This isn't an economic catastrophe. This is just cutting out all the extra trillions of dollars of spending that the federal government got used to over the past 3 years. If we just return to the exact budget from 2017, there is plenty of money to spend. Again, the federal government is bringing in $4.6 trillion in 2023. We know $600 billion of that is going to interest. $4 trillion left over to spend. Just spend it the exact same way it was spent in 2017. Or spend it a different way. I don't care. It doesn't matter. There's enough money. Do you understand what this means? For all the people out there crying that we are going to default on our debt. No, we're not. We've got $4 trillion left over after paying our debt, after paying our interest to spend on all of our stuff without any defaulting. This is without raising the debt ceiling. This is without accumulating more debt. This is without borrowing more. This is keeping the total national debt number the exact same. You have $4 trillion left over to spend, which coincidentally was far more than we ever spent in 2016, 2015, 2014, all of the Obama years going back to 2010. So people think Obama spent a lot of money, and he did. Bush did too. Clinton did too. All of the administrations have spent way more money than they need to. But if we just go back 4 years and use the same budget from a few years ago, there's plenty of money left over. Now at this point you might be thinking, well, that doesn't mean that they won't default, because they would have to choose to spend all that money they're getting on their debt payments and not choose to spend it on the other things. And you're exactly right. And guess what? By both federal law and the Constitution, that's what the Treasury will have to do. Ultimately, when there's not enough money coming in to spend on all the things you originally planned on spending it on, it's the president who has the authority to say which bills we're going to pay and which bills we're not going to pay. But paying the debt is mandated by both federal law and the Constitution. It is a non-negotiable. It must be paid, and there's plenty of income to be able to pay that, which means the discretionary spending piece will by default have to be the piece that gets spent less on. It's not a catastrophe, it's just going back to pre-2020 levels. That's it. Now, if you're putting 2 and 2 together, this means that the Democrats and the Biden administration are the real ones holding the economy hostage here. Because if Biden truly does decide to violate the Constitution and violate federal law, if the debt ceiling is not raised and decides to default on debt payments rather than not pay the discretionary spending, number one, he will trigger a global economic catastrophe as treasuries will get sold off and cease to be the bedrock of the financial system forever. Number two, that will be his choice that is the way the outcome is instead of the default. Default was a poor choice word there. Default as in the natural choice that would happen automatically, not default as in defaulting on bonds. Put very simply, if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling, the federal government will not default on its debt. It will simply have to stop spending money in some of the new areas that has started spending money since 2020. Number two, it will force spending to come in line with revenue, meaning the deficit goes away. The federal government can only spend what they take in taxes. They can still borrow new debt so long as they're using it to pay off old debt. Their interest expenses will increase, and ultimately, the federal government will become a much smaller burden on an overburdened economy. If the debt ceiling does not get raised, less government spending will happen, the deficit will disappear, and the American people will go on living just as they always have. Nothing will change for 99% of Americans. In fact, economically speaking, life will probably get much better for most Americans, seeing that the government becomes a smaller burden on the backs of the American household. And the last thing that politicians want is for its constituents to realize that they don't need them, because the government wants dependence so that it can increase its power. Because if a government can make you dependent on it, then it can increase any power it wants and you can't do anything about it because you're not free, you're their slave. And as one final note here, the Treasury Department has for many years had a plan in place for if we ever get into a situation like this, the debt payments will be made automatically. They will still get paid. It will cease to make any other payments, and the choice on which other payments do not get paid ultimately comes down to the president. But if the United States does default on its debt, it's not because the debt ceiling wasn't raised, it's because the president actively chose to violate federal law and violate the Constitution and default on its debt. If the debt ceiling is not raised, the federal government will have $4 trillion of our money to spend however they wish, which is more than they should have, but it's plenty considering that $4 trillion would have been a surplus from 2010 all the way through 2017, and every year prior to that in the entire history of the United States. And the American household would finally get a little breathing room, inflation would probably start coming down even faster, and it would be the best case scenario. So here's to hoping. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.